It had been nearly 6 months since my mother-in-law had spoken to me directly, so I was surprised when a vague invitation to a family gathering at her country house appeared in my text messages. The message was cold, without details, only mentioning that everyone would be there and that it would be good for me to attend. Despite being exhausted from my teaching job and the pile of essays waiting to be graded, I decided to make the trip. I packed a small suitcase, baked a homemade apple pie, her favorite, though she'd never admit it, and faced the 5-hour drive with a knot in my stomach, trying to convince myself that maybe this time things would be different. Every mile, I drove through the winding Virginia countryside. I fed that tiny flame of hope for reconnection. I'd never been fully accepted by Mark's family, especially his mother, Eleanor. From the moment he introduced me, a public school teacher with liberal views from a blue-collar Boston family, to his upper-crust Richmond relatives, I'd been an outsider. Their polite smiles never reached their eyes, and Eleanor's thinly veiled criticisms about everything from my accent to my casseroles had become a painful constant. Still, I put on my nicest sundress and practiced my warmest smile in the rear-view mirror as I drove. I imagined hugs, conversations, maybe even an apology for the barbed comments exchanged at Christmas when Eleanor had suggested that someone with my background might not understand their family traditions. I'd walked out of the dining room that night, and Mark had followed me, torn between his wife and his mother. He chose me then, but the chasm had only widened since. "It'll be fine," I whispered to myself as I turned onto the long gravel driveway that led to the Caldwell family country house. The sprawling colonial sat on 15 acres of manicured lawn and woodland, a monument to old Virginia money and privilege. I'd always felt small approaching it, but today the feeling was amplified by the eerie silence. No cars in the circular driveway, no sounds of conversation or laughter floating from the porch. A slight unease began forming in my chest as I parked. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn as I carried my overnight bag and the carefully balanced pie toward the house. I noticed the front door was slightly ajar, which seemed odd. "Hello?" I called out, pushing it open. "Mark, Eleanor, anyone home?" What greeted me was a scene of disarray that made my heart sink. Empty wine bottles littered the usually immaculate living room. Plates with crusted food sat on every surface, and the kitchen beyond was in even worse shape. Dishes piled high, in the sink, trash overflowing, and what looked like spilled red wine staining the marble countertop. No sign of a party in progress, just the aftermath of one that had clearly ended. I set my pie down and moved through the house, calling out names with increasing confusion. Mark? Jennifer? Eleanor? The only response was the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. When I reached the kitchen island, I spotted a note propped against a half-empty bottle of bourbon, written in Eleanor's distinctive cursive. "Didn't expect you. Clean everything up." My hands trembled as I read it again, trying to make sense of the words. They hadn't expected me, but the invitation, and then it hit me with the force of a physical blow. There had been no family gathering, at least not today. The realization that Eleanor had deliberately tricked me into driving 5 hours to clean up after what must have been their actual gathering the previous night made my knees weak. I sank onto one of the kitchen stools, the note crumpled in my fist. I pulled out my phone to call Mark, but stopped. What would I say? That his mother had humiliated me again? That I'd fallen for it again? Besides, he was at a conference in Chicago, unreachable during sessions. My next instinct was to call my sister back in Boston, but the thought of explaining this, of hearing the pity in her voice when I admitted how I'd been treated yet again, was unbearable. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the kitchen in orange and pink hues that seemed to mock the darkness I felt inside. 5 hours back home in the dark, exhausted and humiliated, or stay in this empty house and face whatever further humiliation Eleanor had planned. Neither option felt tolerable. I paced the kitchen, anger bubbling up like a pot about to boil over. I imagined leaving the mess exactly as it was, perhaps adding to it, knocking over the remaining bottles, smashing a plate or two. I imagined driving to the nearest hotel, sending a group text to the entire Caldwell family, explaining exactly what I thought of their Southern hospitality. I imagined filing for divorce. But as quickly as these thoughts came, they dissipated, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. Eleanor wanted a reaction. She wanted to prove I didn't belong, that I wasn't good enough for her precious son or her prestigious family. She wanted me gone. I looked down at the note again, at the imperious command. Then I looked around at the chaos of the kitchen, evidence of a gathering I hadn't been invited. To Dee, maybe it had been the annual spring luncheon she hosted for her garden club friends. Or perhaps a small family dinner that, once again, my name had been conveniently left off the guest list. The setting sun cast the last of its light through the French doors that led to the back garden. In that moment, standing in Eleanor's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of her contempt, I made a decision that would alter the course of my relationship with the Caldwell family forever. For a long moment, I stood frozen in the kitchen, my anger burning hot, then quickly giving way to a deeper pain, humiliation. Eleanor had made me drive 5 hours with malicious intent, just to expose me to this. My first impulse was to leave immediately, but something inside made me pause. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was an unwillingness to give her the satisfaction of knowing how deeply she'd hurt me. I put my purse down, found a trash bag under the sink, and silently began collecting empty bottles. The house was eerily quiet as I worked. My hands shook while loading the dishwasher, not just from fatigue but from disbelief. The words of the note echoed like slaps, and even with no one around, I felt watched. This wasn't just a provocation, it was a test. Eleanor wanted me to lose control, to complain, to call Mark crying. But I wouldn't give her that. I would finish the task and leave every dish gleaming as my response. As I scrubbed dried wine from crystal glasses, memories of other slights surfaced. The Christmas Eleanor had forgotten to set a place for me at the table. The time she'd introduced me to her friends as Mark's current girlfriend after we'd been married for 2 years. The family photos where I was positioned at the edges, easy to crop out later. Each recollection fueled my determination to finish the job perfectly. By midnight, the kitchen gleamed. I'd moved to the living room, straightening furniture, vacuuming, crumbs from between sofa cushions, and wiping fingerprints from surfaces. My back ached, and my eyes burned with unshed tears, but I kept working methodically. This house, with its antique furniture and family heirlooms, told the story of generations of Caldwells. There were no photos of me on the walls, no evidence. I existed in their world except as an inconvenience. Around 2 a.m, I finally trudged upstairs with my overnight bag. The guest room, never my room despite years of visits, was at least clean. I inflated the air mattress Eleanor always provided instead of letting me use the actual bed. It was my grandmother's, and the frame is delicate, and lay down in the darkness. Only then, alone in the musty room with its faded floral wallpaper, did I allow myself to cry. Silent tears at first, then muffled sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the years I'd spent trying to earn approval that would never come. I cried for Mark, caught between his wife and the mother who still controlled him in ways he couldn't see. Mostly I cried for myself, for the woman who kept coming back for more rejection, who kept believing things might change. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the unfamiliar creaks of the old house and my own churning thoughts. When dawn broke, I rose, showered, and made the bed with hospital corners Eleanor would approve of. I wrote a brief note. "Everything is clean. Sarah," and left it on the kitchen counter beside my untouched apple pie. The drive home felt longer than the trip out. The Virginia countryside that had seemed so charming yesterday now felt oppressive, each mile a reminder of my foolishness. I stopped once for gas and coffee, but otherwise drove straight through, arriving home by noon. Our apartment felt like a sanctuary after the emotional battleground of the Caldwell house. I called in sick to school for Monday, something I rarely did. I needed time to process, to decide what this meant for my marriage. Mark called that evening from Chicago, cheerful about his conference, oblivious to what had transpired. I didn't tell him. What good would it do? He'd be torn, defensive, would make excuses for his mother as he always did. That's just how she is, Sarah. She doesn't mean anything by it. But we both knew that wasn't true. Eleanor meant every barb, every exclusion. Instead, I told him I was feeling under the weather, that he should enjoy his conference, and that we'd talk when he got home. After hanging up, I sat on our balcony watching the sunset, a glass of wine in hand, contemplating the invisible lines that divided families, the boundaries that some people were allowed to cross with impunity. Tuesday morning, I returned to my 4th grade classroom, throwing myself into lessons with unusual energy. My students noticed, "Ms. Caldwell, you're really excited about fractions today." But teaching had always been my refuge. For those hours, surrounded by 30 children who cared nothing about family politics, I could forget the hollow feeling in my chest. By Wednesday, a new feeling had begun to take root alongside the hurt. Resolve. I'd spent 3 years trying to please Eleanor Caldwell, moderating my Boston accent, learning to make her family recipes, keeping quiet when she made thinly veiled political comments meant to provoke me. I'd bent myself into shapes that didn't fit, all to be accepted by a woman who had decided long ago that I never would be. That evening, I called my sister Kate in Boston. Unlike my previous calls after Eleanor's slights, this time I didn't cry or seek reassurance. "I'm done," I told her simply. "I'm not playing this game anymore." "About time," Kate replied, the relief evident in her voice. "So what are you going to do?" I hadn't fully formulated a plan yet, but I knew this. Whatever came next, I would no longer be seeking Eleanor Caldwell's approval. I would no longer pretend her behavior was acceptable, and I would no longer allow myself to be treated as less than I was. "I'm not sure yet," I answered truthfully, "but I'm done being the family doormat." When Mark returned from Chicago on my Thursday night, I was waiting. We needed to talk about boundaries, about respect, about what I would and wouldn't tolerate going forward. This conversation was years overdue, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But as I watched him wheel his suitcase through the door, looking tired but happy to be home, I steeled myself. This wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. It was about our marriage, and whether it could survive the poison of his mother's hostility. What I didn't know then, as I prepared to confront my husband, was that Eleanor had already made her next move, one that would force a reckoning none of us was prepared for. The conversation with Mark didn't go as planned. Before I could even begin explaining what had happened at the country house, he handed me an envelope. "Mom asked me to give you this," he said, his expression unreadable. Inside was a check for $200 with a note. "For your cleaning services. Professional rates." I stared at the check, speechless. The humiliation I'd thought couldn't cut any deeper somehow found new depths. Mark watched me, confusion crossing his face as my hands began to shake. "What's wrong? I thought you'd be happy. Mom said you helped clean up after their garden club luncheon, and she wanted to compensate you." His obliviousness was its own kind of pain. I carefully explained what had actually happened. The text, the 5-hour drive, the empty house, the command to clean. With each detail, Mark's face fell further. By the end, he was pacing our small living room, running his hands through his hair. "She wouldn't do that," he kept saying. but his protest sounded hollow even to him. There must be some misunderstanding. Call her then, I challenged. Ask her directly if she invited me to a family gathering, or if she tricked me into being her maid. He did call, right there in front of me. I watched his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a resignation that told me everything I needed to know before he even hung up. Eleanor had admitted it, but with a twist. She claimed it had been a test to see if I was truly committed to the family, when she was disappointed I'd failed by complaining. I didn't fail her test by complaining, I said quietly when he relayed this. I failed by existing. Mark slept on the couch that night, torn between loyalty to his mother and recognition of how deeply she'd wronged me. The next morning, he left early for work, without resolving anything. We existed in a strange limbo for days afterward, civil but distant, both unsure how to bridge the chasm that had suddenly opened between us. During that week of uneasy silence, no one from Mark's family contacted me. No apology, no acknowledgement, not even a thank you for cleaning the house. Mark seemed increasingly trapped in his own world, avoiding any topic related to his mother, making excuses to work late. But inside me, something was changing. The hurt was crystallizing into clarity. I used that week to reflect on everything I'd allowed over the years. The subtle put-downs during holiday gatherings, the exclusion from family photos, the way Eleanor would speak about me in the third person even when I was present, how I'd gradually made myself smaller, quieter, less me in an attempt to be more acceptable to them. And how, despite it all, I was still the outsider, the Boston girl who would never belong in their Richmond world. Sitting alone in our apartment each evening, I began to make lists. First, of every slight I could remember. It filled 3 pages of my journal. Then, a list of what I wanted: respect, acknowledgement, boundaries. Finally, a list of what I was willing to do to get those things. This last list surprised me with its boldness. On Wednesday, I called my old college roommate Tanya, now a corporate attorney in D.C. I need some advice, I told her, about property, laws in Virginia. The questions I asked clearly surprised her, but she answered them thoroughly. Professional curiosity piqued. Next, I contacted a real estate agent in Richmond, presenting myself as a potential investor looking for unique opportunities in historic properties. By Friday, I had the information I needed, and a plan taking shape. It would cost nearly all of my savings, the money I'd been putting aside for graduate school. But something told me this investment would pay dividends beyond money. Throughout this planning, Mark and I maintained our strange dance of avoidance. He came home later each night, and when he did, we spoke of trivial things: the weather, his work, my students. Never about his mother or what had happened. Never about the growing distance between us. I could see him struggling, caught between the 2 women in his life, unable to stand firmly with either. In other circumstances, I might have felt sorry for him. Now, I just felt resolved. On Saturday morning, I rose early and drove to Richmond alone. I met with the real estate agent, a sharp-dressed woman named Vivian, who clearly wondered why a public school teacher was interested in property investments, but kept her questions professional. We reviewed documents, discussed terms, and by afternoon, I had signed preliminary papers that set my plan in motion. Driving back to our apartment that evening, I felt strangely calm. The anger and hurt were still there, but now they had purpose. Direction. For the first time since receiving that text message from Eleanor, I felt in control again. Mark was waiting when I got home, sitting at our kitchen table with a concerned expression. "Where have you been all day?" he asked. I was worried. "I had some business to take care of," I replied, setting my purse down. "Actually, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk." "About Mom?" His shoulders tensed immediately. About us, I corrected. About what happens next. He looked so lost sitting there, this man I'd loved for 5 years. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to say we could find a way through this together. But the clearer part knew that wasn't possible, unless things changed fundamentally. I can't. Keep doing this, Mark. I can't keep trying to earn a place in your family that will never be given. And I can't be with someone who won't stand up for me when I'm treated like less than a person. That's not fair, he protested weakly. I'm caught in the middle. You put yourself in the middle, I pointed out. You could have been firmly on my side. That's what partners do. We talked for hours, circling the same points repeatedly. Mark acknowledged his mother's behavior was wrong, but insisted she would never change. I maintained that she didn't need to change. He did. By midnight, we'd reached an exhausted stalemate with no resolution in sight. Sunday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Family dinner next Sunday, 4 p.m. Important announcement. No apology, no acknowledgement of what she'd done. Just another command, another expectation that I would fall in line. I showed the message to Mark. Are you going? He asked hesitantly. Yes, I answered, surprising him. But not as the person she thinks I am. The week that followed was one of the strangest of our marriage. Mark and I existed in parallel, sleeping in the same bed but barely touching, eating at the same table but rarely speaking. He seemed to be waiting for something, for me to break down perhaps, or to forgive and forget, as I always had before. But I was done with that pattern. Instead, I finalized my plans. I had phone calls with Tanya, with Vivian, with a financial advisor. I withdrew my savings and arranged for a cashier's check. I bought a new dress, nothing flashy but more expensive than anything I'd normally wear. And I waited, counting down the days until Sunday's important announcement. What Eleanor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had an announcement of my own to make. Sunday arrived with perfect Virginia spring weather, blue skies, blooming dogwoods, and a gentle breeze that seemed to mock the storm brewing inside me. Mark had left early that morning, mumbling something about helping his father set up for the dinner. He'd been walking on eggshells around me all week, sensing that something had changed but unable to identify what. I took my time getting ready, carefully applying makeup and styling my hair in a way Eleanor would consider appropriate. The new dress, a simple navy sheath that had cost more than I usually spent on clothes for an entire season, hung on the back of the bathroom door. As I slipped it on, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. Not because of the dress, but because of the woman wearing it. Gone was the eager-to-please daughter-in-law, replaced by someone with clear eyes and a straight spine. Instead of driving directly to the Caldwell home in Richmond's historic Fan District, I made a stop at the offices of Tanya's law firm. Though it was Sunday, she'd arranged for a notary to meet us there. Within 30 minutes, the final paperwork was signed, notarized, and filed electronically. Tanya handed me a sealed envelope containing copies of everything. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "More sure than I've been about anything in a long time," I replied, tucking the envelope into my purse. Rather than taking my usual compact car, I'd arranged for a car service, a sleek black Lexus with a professional driver. It was an extravagance I couldn't really afford, but today was about making a statement. As we pulled up to the Caldwell house, I could see several cars already parked along the tree-lined street. The important announcement had drawn a crowd. Manki instructed the driver to wait, then took a moment to observe the scene from the car. Through the large bay windows, I could see people gathered in the formal living room, Eleanor holding court in her favorite armchair, Mark's father Thomas standing by the fireplace with a drink, Jennifer and her husband Paul on the love seat. Mark's brother David was there with his wife Emma, their 2 children running between the adults' legs. Several of Eleanor's friends from the garden club were scattered around the room, all dressed in the understated expensive way that signaled old Richmond money. I watched for a few minutes, invisible as always. No one looked toward the street. No one wondered where I was. I was an afterthought, if I was a thought at all. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked up the brick pathway to the front door. The heavy brass knocker made a satisfying thud against the wood. Jennifer's husband Paul opened the door, his expression shifting from polite welcome to surprise when he saw me. "Sarah, we weren't sure you'd come." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, stepping past him into the foyer. The conversation in the living room dimmed as heads turned in my direction. Eleanor's smile froze in place, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sarah, dear, you're late," she said, making it sound like an accusation. "We were just about to make our announcement." Mark moved toward me, relief and confusion warring on his face. "You look nice," he said quietly, reaching for my hand. I let him take it, but there was no warmth in my grip. "Before you make your announcement," I said, addressing Eleanor directly, "I have something I'd like to share with the family." My voice was steadier than I'd expected, carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. Eleanor's mouth tightened. "This isn't really the time for—" "It won't take long," I interrupted, something I'd never dared to do before. The shock on her face almost made me smile. "And I think you'll find it relevant to whatever you're planning to announce." I reached into my purse and withdrew the envelope Tanya had given me. Moving to the center of the room, I handed it to Mark. "Would you mind opening this and sharing the contents with everyone?" His hands were hesitant as he broke the seal and pulled out the papers. I watched his eyes scan the first page, confusion deepening with each line. "Sarah, what is this?" he finally asked, looking up at me. "Why don't you tell everyone what it says?" I suggested calmly. Mark cleared his throat. It's a deed transfer for the country house. It says—" He trailed off, rereading the document as if expecting the words to change. "It says the Caldwell family country house now legally belongs to me," I finished for him, "along with the 15 acres it sits on." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children seemed to sense the tension, freezing in their play. Eleanor was the first to recover, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, holding out her hand imperiously. "Let me see that." Mark passed her the papers, and I watched as her face drained of color. Thomas moved to read over her shoulder, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "This can't be legal," he sputtered, looking between the document and me. "We never sold the property to you." "Not directly," I agreed. "But 3 weeks ago you sold it to Hillcrest Holdings to avoid capital gains tax on another property sale. Hillcrest Holdings is a shell company that, as of yesterday, belongs to me." Eleanor's hands were shaking now. "How did you even know about that transaction? It was private." "Public records aren't actually private," I replied. "And it's amazing what people will tell you when you present yourself as a potential investor rather than an unwanted daughter-in-law." The room erupted in confused chatter. Jennifer was frantically whispering to Paul. David was demanding answers from his father. Mark just stared at me, seeing me, truly seeing me, perhaps for the first time since we'd met. Eleanor stood suddenly, the papers clutched in her fist. "Whatever game you're playing, it won't work. Thomas, call Richard," she commanded, referring to their family lawyer. "He'll tell you the same thing," I said. "The sale was legal, the transfer is legal, and the property is now mine." I turned to face the entire room. Which brings me to why I'm here today. I believe Eleanor and Thomas had an announcement to make about the country house. All eyes turned to Eleanor, whose face had gone from pale to mottled red. I'd guessed correctly. Their important announcement had something to do with the property they thought they still owned. "Go ahead," I encouraged her, taking a seat on the arm of an empty chair. "I'm very interested to hear what you had planned." Eleanor remained frozen, the crumpled papers still clutched in her trembling hand. Thomas placed a steadying arm around her shoulders, his florid face now ashen. The silence stretched painfully until Mark broke it. "Mom? Dad? What was the announcement about the country house?" Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, landing everywhere, but on me. That is, your father and I." She stopped, seemingly unable to continue. Thomas cleared his throat. "We were planning to announce that we're converting the country house into a family trust," he said, voice lacking its usual confidence. "Each of you, David, Mark, and Jennifer, would have received a portion, with the main house remaining under our control during our lifetime." Understanding dawned on Mark's face. "But if Sarah owns it now, then there's nothing to put in the trust," I finished. "At least, not without my consent." David stepped forward, his lawyer's mind clearly racing to find a loophole. "How much? Did you pay Hillcrest? We can buy it back at a reasonable profit to you." "That's not why I bought it," I replied calmly. "Then why?" Jennifer asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Of all the Caldwell siblings, she'd been the least openly hostile. To me, though, she'd never been particularly warm either. I stood up, smoothing my dress. 2 weeks ago, Eleanor invited me to a family gathering at the country house. I drove 5 hours to find an empty house with a mess left from what I now understand was the garden club's spring luncheon. There was a note telling me to clean everything. Jennifer gasped. Paul looked uncomfortable. David's wife Emma glanced sharply at Eleanor. "So I cleaned," I continued. "I spent the night on an air mattress, and I drove 5 hours back the next day. No one called to check if I'd arrived safely. No one thanked me. Instead, I received a check for cleaning services." I turned directly to Eleanor, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. "You've made it abundantly clear that I'm not family. I'm a servant at best. An intruder, more accurately. So I decided to stop pretending otherwise." One of Eleanor's garden club friends rose quietly, murmuring about family matters, and making a discreet exit. 2 others quickly followed. The family's private humiliation was becoming too uncomfortable to witness. "You had no right," Eleanor finally managed, her voice a harsh whisper. "That house has been in the Caldwell family for generations." "And legally it still is," I replied. "I'm a Caldwell too, remember? By marriage, if not by your acceptance." Thomas stepped forward, lawyer mode engaging. "What do you want, Sarah? Money? Some sort of revenge?" "I want what I've always wanted," I said simply. "Respect." Mark moved to my side, finally finding his voice. "Mom, did you really do that? Make Sarah drive all that way just to clean up after your luncheon?" Eleanor's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. "It wasn't like that," she finally said. It was meant to be a lesson." "A lesson in what?" Mark pressed. "In family loyalty," Eleanor burst out. "In understanding her place. Your grandmother cleaned that house for 40 years. My mother-in-law expected it of me when I married your father. It's tradition." "It's humiliation," I corrected. "And it stops now." David, ever the pragmatist, stepped in. "Let's all take a breath. There must be a reasonable solution here." He turned to me with the patronizing smile he reserved for difficult clients. "Sarah, surely we can come to some arrangement. The country house means a lot to this family. It meant enough that you were willing to trick me into being your maid," I replied, "but not enough to include me in your family gatherings." Jennifer, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "She's right. You know? All eyes turned to her in surprise. We've been awful to Sarah, all of us, but especially you, Mom. Eleanor looked as if she'd been slapped. Jennifer Caldwell Hayes, how dare. It's true, Jennifer insisted, color rising in her cheeks. We've excluded her, criticized her, treated her like she's somehow less than us because she didn't grow up with family money or go to the right schools. It's shameful. Paul squeezed his wife's hand in silent support. It was the first time any Caldwell had openly acknowledged how I'd been treated. A tense silence fell over the room. I could feel Mark's eyes on me, questioning, uncertain. He'd been caught in the middle for so long that he'd become paralyzed, unable to fully stand with either side. Now, with everything laid bare, he had to choose. What happens now? He asked, quietly. With the house? I opened my purse again and removed a second envelope. Inside is my plan for the property. I'd like you all to review it. Thomas took the envelope with obvious reluctance. He extracted several pages of legal documents and began reading, his expression changing from suspicion to confusion to something approaching respect. When he finished, he handed the papers to Eleanor without comment. She scanned them quickly, then looked up at me with narrowed eyes. You can't be serious. I'm entirely serious, I replied. What is it? Mark asked, moving to read over his mother's shoulder. His eyes widened as he absorbed the content. Sarah, this is generous, Thomas finished for him. Unexpectedly so. David grabbed the papers impatiently. What does it say? Sarah is proposing to convert the property into a true family trust, Thomas explained, but with conditions. Each family member would have equal access and equal responsibility. No one person, not even Sarah as the legal owner, could make unilateral decisions about its use or maintenance. And? Eleanor prompted bitterly. What's the catch? The catch, I said, is that all family members must be treated with equal respect. Any verified complaint of mistreatment results in loss of access privileges for 6 months. 3 strikes, and that person loses their stake permanently. The room fell silent again as the implications sank in. I was offering them back their beloved country house, but with a fundamental shift in power dynamics. No longer could Eleanor use the property as a weapon in her arsenal of exclusion. No longer could the Caldwell family maintain the facade of Southern gentility while practicing calculated cruelty. This is blackmail, Eleanor finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. This is accountability, I corrected. Something this family has managed to avoid for a very long time. Mark was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something that might have been admiration. You planned all this in just 2 weeks? I had help, I admitted. Turns out there are people in my life who actually value me. The barb landed precisely where I'd aimed it. Mark flinched, and for the first time, I saw genuine shame in his eyes. The agreement requires signatures from all adult family members, I continued. You have until the end of the month to decide. If anyone chooses not to sign, the property will be donated to the Virginia Women's Shelter Foundation. Eleanor gasped. You wouldn't dare. Try me, I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. Decades of Caldwell privilege stared back at me, affronted by my audacity. But beneath the outrage, I saw something new. Uncertainty. For the first time, Eleanor, Caldwell wasn't sure she would win. I left the Caldwell house that evening without waiting for a collective decision. I'd said what I needed to say, laid out my terms, and now the ball was in their court. The drive back to our apartment was quiet. Mark beside me in the hired car, both of us lost in our own thoughts. How long have you been planning this? He finally asked as we crossed the city limits. Since the cleaning incident, I replied honestly. Though I've been saving that money for years, it was supposed to be for my master's degree. He winced. You spent your education fund on this? I spent it on self-respect, I corrected. Something I should have invested in a long time ago. When we arrived home, Mark hesitated at the door. I don't know if I should come in. I studied his face in the dim hallway light, the face I'd fallen in love with 5 years ago, the face that now seemed both familiar and strange. That depends, I said, on which side of that trust agreement you plan to stand. He followed me inside, and we stayed up talking until dawn. Not just about the country house or his mother's behavior, but about all the compromises I'd made that he'd failed to notice, all the times he'd chosen peace over justice. By morning, something had shifted between us. Whether it would bring us closer or push us further apart remained to be seen. The next day, the calls began. First from Jennifer, expressing a mixture of apology and admiration. I always wished I had the courage to stand up to Mom like that, she admitted. If you really go through with the trust, it could change everything. Next came David, all business, wanting to review the legal details. He seemed to think he could find a loophole, some way to maintain the old power structure, while appearing to embrace the new one. I referred him to Tanya, who had anticipated most of his maneuvers. Thomas called on Wednesday, his tone gruff, but not unkind. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said. Eleanor is adjusting to the idea. Give her time. Mark watched these interactions with a kind of wonder, as if seeing his family, and me, with new eyes. I never realized how much you put up with, he admitted one evening. How did you stand it for so long? I loved you, I said simply. And I thought that meant accepting your family on their terms. And now? Now I know better. Loving you doesn't mean erasing myself. By Friday, every Caldwell except Eleanor had called, texted, or emailed me about the trust proposal. Some were cautiously supportive, others obviously calculating the angles, but all were engaging with the new reality I'd created. The property they'd taken for granted was now a negotiation, and I held the stronger position. Eleanor's silence stretched into the weekend, then into the following week. Mark spoke with her briefly and reported that she was processing. I translated this to mean she was looking for ways to regain control of the situation and finding none. 10 days after the confrontation, my phone rang while I was grading papers in my classroom after school. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. Sarah Caldwell speaking, I answered. There was a pause, then Eleanor's voice, stiff with formality. This is Eleanor. I'd like to meet with you. Alone. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a tea room downtown that neither of us frequented regularly. When I arrived, Eleanor was already seated, perfectly coiffed as always, but with new lines of strain around her mouth. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat down across from her. The words sounded rehearsed. What can I do for you, Eleanor? I kept my tone polite, but not deferential. She took a measured sip of her tea before answering. I've been thinking about your proposal, about the trust. And? Her fingers tightened around her teacup. It's not without merit. Coming from Eleanor Caldwell, this was tantamount to effusive praise. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. The country house has always been important to our family, she continued. To me, especially. My grandfather built it. I spent every summer there as a child. I know, I said. Mark has told me the stories. Yes. Well, she straightened a spoon that was already perfectly aligned with her saucer. What you may not know is that when I married Thomas, my mother-in-law made it very clear that I was an outsider, that I needed to earn my place in the Caldwell family. I felt a flicker of surprise. This wasn't a direction I'd expected the conversation to take. She was cruel, Eleanor continued, the admission clearly difficult for her, in ways that would seem small to anyone else but were designed to make me feel inferior. The country house was her domain, and she used it to put me in my place at every opportunity. So you did the same to me, I said, understanding dawning. You passed on the tradition. She didn't deny it. I told myself it was different. That I was teaching you what it meant to be a Caldwell. By humiliating me. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something other than contempt in them. Not quite regret, but perhaps recognition. Yes. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her admission hanging between us. I won't sign your trust agreement, she finally said. My heart sank, but I kept my expression neutral. That's your choice. Not because I disagree with its premise, she clarified, but because I don't want access to the house anymore. This caught me off guard. I don't understand. Eleanor set down her teacup with careful precision. I want you to keep the house. Use it how you see fit. Make it yours in a way I was never allowed to make it mine. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Break the cycle, as they say these days. I studied her face, looking for the trap, the hidden agenda. Why? Because you were right, she said simply. What I did was inexcusable, and continuing to fight you for control of that house would only perpetuate what my mother-in-law did to me, what I did to you, and what someone would eventually do to Jennifer or Emma or whoever comes next. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. Eleanor Caldwell would probably never bring herself to say the words, "I'm sorry." But it was an acknowledgement, and perhaps that was worth more. I'll think about it, I said carefully. She nodded, then reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope. This is for you, a wedding gift, long overdue. Inside was a check for an amount that made my eyes widen. For your master's degree, Eleanor explained. Since you spent your savings on teaching this old woman a lesson she should have learned decades ago. I wanted to refuse it, to tell her that my self-respect wasn't for sale. But looking at her face, proud, but also for the first time vulnerable, I understood that this wasn't a bribe. It was restitution. Thank you, I said, tucking the check away. I'll use it. Well? We finished our tea in a strange but not uncomfortable silence. As we prepared to leave, Eleanor paused. Mark is a better man because of you, she said. I wasn't ready to see that before. In the months that followed, the Caldwell family dynamics shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The trust agreement was eventually signed by everyone except Eleanor, who maintained that she wanted no claim on the property. Mark and I renovated the main house, removing the outdated floral wallpaper and heavy drapes that had been Eleanor's mother-in-law's taste, replacing them with simpler, brighter decor that felt like us. We hosted our first family gathering there, that summer, a casual barbecue, rather than the formal affairs Eleanor had always insisted upon. Jennifer brought a boyfriend Thomas and Eleanor would never have approved of. David actually laughed. And Eleanor, to everyone's surprise, arrived with a homemade pie and a bottle of wine, staying on the periphery but present nonetheless. Mark found me on the porch swing late that evening, watching fireflies rise from the lawn. Happy? He asked, sitting beside me. I considered the question. The past year had transformed me in ways I was still discovering. I had stood up for myself, risked my marriage, spent my savings, and challenged a family dynamic that had persisted for generations. I had lost the eager-to-please woman I'd been and found someone stronger, clearer, more certain of her worth. Yes, I said, leaning against his shoulder. But not because they finally accept me. Then why? I watch the fireflies, their brief, brilliant lights illuminating the gathering darkness, because I finally accept myself.